It was supposed to be a celebration of everything we'd built together. 10 years of marriage, a life we'd crafted with care. Elena had always insisted anniversaries were special, not just a marker of time, but a reminder of love, of partnership. So when she told me she had to leave town for a business retreat on the very weekend we'd planned to celebrate, it caught me off guard. Her explanation was simple. Her company's investors had scheduled a mandatory off-site workshop. She even showed me the email on her phone. Official wording, company logo. All of it looked legitimate. Still, the timing stung. We'd made reservations at the same seaside inn where we'd spend our honeymoon. She promised we'd reschedule, but her tone had been unusually brisk, as if she wanted to close the discussion before it started. On the day she left, Elena kissed me goodbye and told me not to wait up. Her suitcase was small, packed for just 2 nights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about her demeanor was off. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't until 2 days later, when I bumped into an old acquaintance at the gym, that the first solid crack appeared. Jonathan was a regional manager at Elena's company, and as we exchanged pleasantries, I casually mentioned her work retreat. Jonathan blinked, clearly puzzled. "What retreat?" he asked. "We haven't had anything like that scheduled in months." For a moment, I stood there, my towel slung over my shoulder, trying to process what he just said. I asked him again, more carefully, if he was sure. He gave me a sympathetic smile and shook his head, adding that he'd know if something big like that was happening. I walked out of the gym feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath me. Her trip wasn't just inconvenient. It was a lie. I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with reasons she might have lied. Maybe she'd been embarrassed to admit she was meeting friends, or taking some time for herself. But why invent a work event? And why go to such lengths to make it seem real? The next morning, I decided to call the inn we'd originally booked for our anniversary, just to cancel the reservation. I wasn't in the mood to explain myself, so I simply told the receptionist I needed to confirm the details first. When she read back the reservation, my heart stopped. The room hadn't been canceled. Even more surprising was the fact that it wasn't booked under my name. It was under hers. I thanked the receptionist and hung up, my thoughts racing. If she hadn't canceled it, that meant she was still planning to use the reservation. But with whom? That evening, I couldn't bring myself to say anything to her on the phone when she called to check in. Her voice was light, casual, as if nothing had changed. She said she was exhausted from a long day of meetings and would head to bed early. I told her I loved her, and she said it back, the words so smooth they felt practiced. The next day, I drove to the seaside inn. The hotel was just as I remembered it, quaint and charming, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. When I walked into the lobby, I felt like an intruder in a place that had once held some of my happiest memories. The receptionist greeted me with a bright smile, clearly recognizing my name from our conversation. When I asked if Elena had checked in, she hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her computer. "Yes," she said finally. "She arrived yesterday." I asked if she was alone. The receptionist hesitated again, then lowered her voice. "There's another guest listed with her," she admitted. "A man named Lucas." Lucas, a name I didn't know. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I kept my composure, thanking her before stepping outside. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I hadn't just stumbled across a coincidence or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I had evidence. Elena had lied, invented a story, and come here with someone else. I stared at the ocean in the distance, the waves crashing against the rocks below, and felt the weight of the betrayal settle over me. I knew there was more to uncover, but for the first time, I couldn't deny what was happening. My wife was hiding something from me, something that could tear our life apart, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The receptionist's words, "Elena checked in 2 days ago. Room 206," rang in my ears, anchoring me to that spot in the lobby. I stood there, staring at the staircase that led to the upper floors, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. A part of me didn't want to go further, didn't want to confirm what I already knew in my gut. But another part, the part that couldn't stomach lies, the part that refused to be made a fool of, propelled me forward. The hallway on the second floor was quiet, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. My pulse thundered in my ears as I walked past the row of identical doors. Room 206 stood at the far end, its brass number plate gleaming under the soft overhead lights. For a moment, I hesitated, my hand hovering near the door. What would I find inside? What version of Elena would be waiting for me? The thought of her laughing with someone else, her hands brushing against his, made my stomach churn. I leaned closer, faint voices filtered through, muffled but unmistakably hers. Elena's voice, light and familiar, carried a warmth that had been absent from our conversations for months. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. It was her tone that cut deepest, so casual, so personal. And then I heard his voice, deep and smooth. It answered hers with an ease that turned my anger into something sharper, colder. Whoever he was, this man wasn't a stranger to her. There was history here, something that stretched beyond the walls of this room. My hand tightened into a fist, shaking with rage as I forced myself to stay composed. Barging in without a plan wouldn't give me what I needed. I stepped back from the door, glancing down the hallway. The hotel's layout was familiar. I'd stayed here before, years ago. I knew there was a service area down the hall, a space where housekeeping stored supplies. I found it unlocked. Inside, shelves lined with linens and cleaning products crowded the small space. I scanned the room until I found what I needed. A staff pass card, left carelessly on a counter. It was risky, but my fury outweighed my hesitation. With the card in hand, I returned to room 206. I swiped the card, the light on the lock flashing green. The soft click of the door opening was deafening in the silence. I pushed it open an inch, enough to peek inside. The room was modest, with a king-sized bed, a small seating area, and a window that overlooked the ocean. Elena sat on the bed, her back to the door, laughing at something the man in the armchair had just said. Lucas. I didn't need an introduction to know it was him. He exuded a smug confidence, the kind of ease that came from knowing you'd won. His posture was relaxed, his legs stretched out as he held a glass of wine. The sight of her leaning toward him, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, was a dagger to the chest. I stepped into the room. The sound of the door clicking shut behind me made them both turn, their expressions shifting in an instant. Elena's face paled, her smile vanishing as her eyes widened in shock. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't flinch. He set his glass down slowly, his gaze meeting mine with an infuriating calm. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks outside. Elena stood quickly, her hands outstretched as if to block me from Lucas. She started to say something, her words stumbling over themselves, but I cut her off. My voice was cold, controlled, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I demanded to know what was going on, to hear the truth from her lips. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and Lucas, as if searching for an escape. And then Lucas spoke. He rose from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was savoring the moment. He didn't bother with pleasantries or denials. Instead, he smirked, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that he and Elena had been seeing each other for months. Her gasp was audible, her hands flying to her mouth as though she hadn't expected him to be so blunt. I turned to her, my voice rising as I demanded the truth. Had everything we built meant so little to her? Did she even care about the destruction she'd caused? Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain, her words spilling out in a panicked rush. She said she hadn't planned for this to happen, that she'd felt lost, disconnected, unloved. She claimed Lucas had been there for her when I wasn't, offering her something I'd stopped giving her years ago. Her words stung, but they weren't enough to justify what she had done. I turned to Lucas, who was watching the scene unfold with infuriating amusement. I wanted to hit him, to wipe the smug expression off his face, but I held back. He wasn't worth it. Instead, I looked back at Elena, my voice trembling as I told her the truth. This wasn't something I could forgive. I turned and walked out, her cries following me into the hallway. My vision blurred with anger and grief as I made my way back to the car. I didn't look back. The days following the confrontation at the inn were a blur of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. Elena had tried calling me repeatedly, but I ignored her. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses again, and I wasn't ready to decide what came next. I spent the nights at a small motel on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment I'd walked into that room. By the third day, I returned home, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't live indefinitely in a motel. The house felt unfamiliar, like someone else's space, its walls tainted by the knowledge of what Elena had done. Her betrayal was woven into everything: the furniture, the photos, even the air itself. She was there when I arrived. I had expected her to be gone, but instead, she was waiting on the porch, her expression hollow and tear-streaked. She tried to talk to me as I walked past her into the house, pleading for me to give her a chance to explain. I told her there was nothing left to say. Her words didn't matter anymore. Her actions had spoken louder than anything she could say. For the next 2 days, we lived in a strange, strained silence. She stayed in the guest room while I avoided her as much as possible, barely acknowledging her presence. I thought she would leave eventually, but she didn't. Then, on the 4th day, Lucas showed up. I was in the garage, trying to distract myself by organizing old tools, when I heard voices outside. At first, I thought it might be one of the neighbors stopping by, but when I stepped out into the driveway, I froze. Lucas was standing at the edge of the yard, his hands in his pockets, his stance casual. Elena stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. I stormed over, my blood boiling at the sight of him so close to my home. Before I could say a word, he raised his hands in mock surrender, his smile infuriatingly calm. He said he wasn't there to cause trouble, that he only wanted to talk to Elena. His words were smooth, rehearsed, like he was used to diffusing conflict. But I wasn't interested in playing his game. I told him to leave, my voice low and cold. He glanced at Elena, who looked away, her body stiff with tension. It was clear she hadn't invited him here. Not this time. Lucas shrugged, his smile never faltering, and said he'd respect my wishes. But before he left, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a tone only I could hear. "Just remember," he said, "this isn't over." The words sent a chill through me, their meaning clear. He wasn't just here for Elena. He was here to assert control, to remind me that he had already taken something from me. After he left, I confronted Elena, demanding to know why he had come. She insisted she hadn't contacted him, that she had no idea why he'd shown up. Her voice trembled with fear, and for the first time, I believed her. But Lucas's visit wasn't the last. Over the next few days, I saw him more often, parked across the street in his car, loitering at the corner of the block, always just far enough away to avoid confrontation. It felt like he was taunting me, daring me to react. One evening, I returned from work to find Elena pacing in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She told me Lucas had sent her a message, claiming he wanted to fix things, and that he wasn't going to disappear so easily. Her fear was palpable, and for a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I reminded myself that she had brought him into our lives, and now we were both paying the price. That night, as I sat in the darkness of the living room, I began to wonder if Lucas's motives went deeper than I'd thought. He wasn't just pursuing Elena. He was playing a game, one I didn't fully understand yet. The next morning, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. The handwriting was bold and precise, and the message was chilling in its simplicity. "You don't know the whole story." My grip on the paper tightened as I scanned the street, but there was no sign of him. The words stayed with me all day, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. What didn't I know? What was Lucas trying to imply? For the first time since the confrontation at the inn, I realized I might not have uncovered everything. There was more to this, something hidden beneath the surface. And if Lucas thought he could use it against me, he was wrong. The note haunted me. "You don't know the whole story." The words felt like a trap, carefully laid to pull me deeper into Lucas's twisted game. I wanted to throw it away, to forget it altogether, but curiosity and anger wouldn't let me. What more could there be? I thought I'd uncovered the worst of it, Yet Lucas's presence was a constant reminder that this was far from over. That evening, Elena stayed locked in the guest room, her fear palpable. She claimed she hadn't spoken to Lucas since his first visit, but the tension in her voice told me there was more she wasn't saying. My trust in her had evaporated, leaving a void that now filled with suspicion at every turn. I needed answers, and I knew Lucas wouldn't stop until he got whatever it was he wanted. The next morning, I decided to confront him. I didn't wait for him to come to me this time. I tracked down his license plate from the photos I'd taken of his car when he loitered on our street. A friend who worked in law enforcement owed me a favor and pulled the information for me. Lucas lived in an upscale condo downtown, his address just another symbol of his confidence and affluence. I drove there after work, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The building was sleek and modern, with a concierge at the desk who barely glanced at me as I walked past. I rode the elevator to his floor, my jaw clenched as I rehearsed what I'd say when I saw him. When I knocked on his door, it opened almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting me. Lucas stood there, wearing a casual button-down shirt and an infuriatingly calm smile. His demeanor was so casual that it made my blood boil. He invited me in, gesturing to the minimalist living room beyond the threshold. The audacity of the man was staggering, as if this was just another business meeting. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside, determined to get the answers I needed. I demanded to know what he wanted, why he was still circling my life like a vulture. He didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of concern. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat on the edge of a sleek leather sofa. He started talking, his voice smooth and calculated. He admitted that he and Elena had been seeing each other for months, but claimed it wasn't just about the affair. He said there were bigger things at play, things I wouldn't understand yet. I told him to cut the cryptic nonsense, my voice rising with frustration. I was done with his games, and I needed the truth. That's when he dropped the bombshell. Lucas leaned forward, his gaze sharp, and told me he wasn't just Elena's lover. He was her business partner. I froze, my mind struggling to process his words. He explained how they had quietly opened an account together months ago to fund a side venture, one that he claimed had the potential to make them both rich. Elena, he said, had been struggling financially with her job, and he had stepped in to help. He smirked as he added that the affair wasn't planned. It just happened during their late-night meetings to discuss the venture. The anger I felt was indescribable, but beneath it was something worse, doubt. If what Lucas said was true, then Elena hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd used our finances to fuel their scheme. I demanded to know what the business was, but Lucas refused to answer, saying it was confidential. I left his condo in a daze, my fury barely contained. My mind raced with questions. Was he lying to manipulate me, or was this the truth Elena hadn't told me? Back home, I confronted her. At first, she denied everything, her voice trembling as she pleaded with me to believe her. But when I mentioned Lucas's claims, her face crumpled. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands covering her face as the truth spilled out. She admitted that Lucas had approached her months ago with an investment opportunity, something he claimed would change their lives. She had been desperate. Her job wasn't as stable as she'd led me to believe, and she hadn't wanted me to know she was struggling. When I demanded to know where the money had come from, her silence was the final blow. She didn't have to say it. I already knew. She had taken it from our savings. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She begged me to understand, saying she had planned to pay it all back once the business succeeded. But all I could hear was the sound of my trust shattering. As she tried to explain, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Now you know. Let's see what you do with it." It was from Lucas. I stared at the message, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He wasn't just playing games with Elena. He was playing games with me. This wasn't about love or money anymore. It was about control, and I wasn't going to let him win. Lucas's message was a taunt, a calculated move to keep me spinning in his web. I stared at the screen, the glow of the phone casting harsh shadows on the counter. He wanted me to react, to lash out, to play into whatever twisted game he was orchestrating. But if Lucas thought I was going to crumble, he underestimated me. The first thing I did was take control of the situation. Elena, still trembling from the confrontation, tried to plead her case again, but I shut her down. Her words meant nothing now. Her actions had already spoken volumes. I told her, coldly and firmly, that she needed to stay out of my way while I handled things. That night, I reviewed every detail I had about Lucas and his connection to Elena. The business venture, the stolen savings, the affair. It was all tangled together, and I needed to separate fact from manipulation. The next morning, I made a call to a private investigator. His name was Mason, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. I gave him everything I had, Lucas's name, his address, the note on my windshield, even the supposed business venture. Mason promised to dig deep and report back as quickly as possible. In the meantime, I decided to take a more direct approach. If Lucas wanted to play games, I was going to play smarter. The first step was visiting the bank. I needed to know exactly how much of our savings Elena had siphoned away and where it had gone. Sitting across from the bank manager, I felt a wave of humiliation as I explained the situation, but it was necessary. The numbers were worse than I'd feared. Over $50,000 had been transferred in the past 6 months to an account tied to Lucas. The account name wasn't even disguised. It was blatantly under his personal business, a move so bold it made my stomach turn. When I returned home, Elena was waiting for me. She looked pale, her guilt written across her face. I could tell she wanted to ask where I'd been, but the tension in the room kept her silent. I spent the rest of the day preparing. Lucas had made it clear he wasn't going to back off, but I needed to understand why. Was it just the money? Or was there something else driving him? Mason called me later that evening with his first round of findings. Lucas, it seemed, wasn't just a confident manipulator. He was dangerous. Mason had uncovered a string of failed ventures tied to Lucas's name, each one leaving a trail of angry investors and lawsuits. He was a master of creating the illusion of success, using charm and fake credentials to lure people into his schemes. But what Mason told me next made my blood run cold. Lucas had a history of targeting women. In 3 previous cases Mason uncovered, Lucas had seduced women with access to money, using their connections and resources to fund his scams. Once the money ran dry, he disappeared, leaving them to pick up the pieces. It wasn't just about the affair. Lucas had seen Elena as an opportunity. Mason also mentioned something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. Lucas had been named in an open investigation involving threats and intimidation. One of his previous victims had reported receiving menacing messages and being followed after she tried to expose him. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. This wasn't just about saving my marriage or recovering the money. This was about protecting myself and Elena from a man who thrived on destruction. The next day, Lucas made another move. He showed up at my office, unannounced, wearing that same smug smile. He didn't ask to see me. He simply waited in the lobby, as if daring me to come down. I kept my composure as I approached him, though every instinct screamed to punch that grin off his face. He greeted me casually, as if we were old friends, and told me we needed to clear the air. I told him to leave, but he stepped closer, his tone dropping to something darker. He said he wasn't going anywhere, not until he got what he wanted. When I asked him what that was, he laughed. "You'll see," he said, turning to leave. "You'll see very soon." The next morning, I woke to find another note under my windshield. This one was shorter, more direct. "Time's running out." I knew then that Lucas wasn't just playing a game. He was escalating, testing how far he could push me. But what Lucas didn't know was that I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning. And when the time came, he wouldn't see me coming. I spent the next day working with Mason to unravel more of Lucas's past. The investigator was thorough, delivering updates like clockwork. What he found painted a picture of a man who thrived on manipulation. Lucas had no legitimate business to his name. The ventures he pitched were smoke and mirrors. Every success he claimed was built on other people's losses, carefully orchestrated to keep him one step ahead of the law. But what caught my attention most was something Mason uncovered about Elena's involvement. The business partnership Lucas had sold her wasn't a legitimate investment. It was a shell company, a name on paper used to funnel money from unsuspecting backers into Lucas's pockets. And the kicker? Elena wasn't just an accomplice. Lucas had listed her as a co-owner, tying her legally to his schemes. If this blew up, she wouldn't just lose the money. She could face criminal charges. When I confronted her that night, she broke. The guilt, the fear, and the reality of what she had gotten herself into finally overwhelmed her. Through tears, she admitted that she had been desperate to make up for the financial struggles she'd hidden from me. Lucas had promised her a way out, a chance to rebuild her confidence and her independence. She hadn't just betrayed me, she betrayed herself. But I couldn't let that excuse her. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that she needed to decide where she stood. Lucas was dangerous, and the longer she let him linger in her life, the worse this was going to get. She begged me to help her fix it. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let her face the consequences of her choices. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, couldn't abandon her entirely. That night, I reached out to Mason again. We formulated a plan, one that involved both strategy and risk. 2 days later, I made my move. Lucas had been circling my house again, his car parked a few blocks down like a wolf waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Instead of confronting him outright, I walked out of the house calmly, my phone in hand, and approached his car. He rolled down the window before I even knocked, that same infuriating smirk plastered across his face. "You're getting bold," I said, my voice steady. "I like to be hands-on," he replied smoothly, leaning back in his seat as though this was a casual chat. I told him I wanted to make a deal. His interest piqued, and he raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to elaborate. I said I was willing to pay him to walk away, to leave Elena, leave our lives, and disappear for good. Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "You think this is just about money?" he said. "You're more naive than I thought." But I had anticipated his response. I told him I knew about his past, his scams, and the investigation Mason had uncovered. I dangled the threat of exposure, letting him know just how much I had on him. His smile faltered for the first time, and I pressed harder. "I have every piece of evidence I need to end this," I said, leaning closer. "You think you're untouchable, but one phone call is all it takes to destroy everything you've built." Lucas's eyes narrowed, the confident facade cracking. He asked what I wanted. "Simple," I said. "I want you gone. For good." For the first time, Lucas looked unsure. He leaned back, considering his options, before finally nodding. He agreed to meet me the next day to finalize things, whatever finalize meant to him. But I wasn't stupid. I knew Lucas wasn't the type to give up so easily. The next morning, Mason and I put the second part of the plan into motion. Using the evidence we'd gathered, financial records, fake contracts, even recordings of Lucas's threats, we contacted law enforcement. Mason had connections with detectives who specialized in fraud, and Lucas's pattern of behavior fit their profile perfectly. It wasn't just about protecting Elena anymore. It was about making sure Lucas couldn't do this to anyone else. When Lucas arrived at the agreed meeting spot, a quiet cafe outside the city, he had no idea he was being watched. Mason had positioned himself nearby, his camera capturing every move. I sat across from Lucas, keeping my voice calm as I went through the motions of negotiating. What Lucas didn't know was that officers were already on their way, armed with enough evidence to arrest him on multiple charges. As the minutes ticked by, Lucas's confidence returned, and he started to push his demands. He wanted more money, more guarantees. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that he was walking into a trap. When the police arrived, Lucas's expression shifted from smug to panicked. They approached the table calmly, their badges flashing, and told him to stand up. He tried to talk his way out of it, of course, but the evidence was airtight. As they led him away, he turned back to me, his eyes full of rage. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. But for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. Lucas was finally out of our lives, and though the damage he'd caused couldn't be undone, I knew I'd done everything I could to protect what little remained of the life we'd built. Now, it was up to Elena and me to decide if there was anything left worth saving. The house felt heavy, the air thick with unresolved tension. Elena and I existed like strangers under the same roof, our conversations brief and strained. The betrayal, the lies, and the fear had carved a canyon between us, and neither of us knew how to bridge it. The first few days after his arrest were filled with paperwork and questions from law enforcement. Detectives wanted every detail we had about Lucas's schemes, pressing Elena for specifics about her involvement. She answered haltingly, her voice raw from exhaustion and guilt. Watching her recount everything, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at her complicity, pity for how deeply she'd been manipulated, and a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. When the questioning ended, she turned to me in the car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She said she wanted to make things right, that she'd do whatever it took to earn my forgiveness. But her words felt hollow, like a promise made too late. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The next week, I threw myself into work, avoiding home as much as possible. I needed space to think, to figure out if I could ever look at Elena the same way again. Every time I thought of Lucas's smug face, of the lies she had told to protect him, a knot tightened in my chest. But the silence wasn't sustainable. One evening, I came home to find her in the living room, a stack of papers spread out on the coffee table. She'd pulled every document related to our finances, the savings she drained, the fake contracts she'd signed with Lucas, the remnants of her misguided trust in him. She told me she wanted to be transparent, to show me everything so there were no more secrets between us. I sat across from her, staring at the papers, feeling a weight settle over me. This was the reality of what Lucas had done, but it was also the reality of what Elena had allowed. She began to cry, her voice breaking as she apologized over and over. She said she had been desperate, that she hadn't wanted to disappoint me by admitting her struggles. She said Lucas had made her feel seen, understood, and capable in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to yell, to demand why she hadn't come to me, why she had chosen a stranger over the man who had stood by her for a decade. But instead, I sat in silence, letting her words wash over me. When she finished, she looked at me with tear-filled eyes and asked if I could ever forgive her. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked her something I hadn't dared to ask before. Do you even love me anymore? Her face crumpled as she nodded, swearing that she did. But her love, if it was real, had been twisted by lies and betrayal. Over the following weeks, we started the painful process of unraveling the mess Lucas had left behind. With Mason's help, we filed claims to recover some of the stolen money, though the odds of seeing much of it were slim. The legal proceedings against Lucas dragged on, and Elena was called to testify as a key witness in his case. Watching her on the stand, recounting the ways Lucas had manipulated her, I felt a pang of something I didn't expect: empathy. She had made terrible choices, but she had also been a victim of his charm and schemes. When the trial ended and Lucas was sentenced to prison for fraud, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt empty. His removal from our lives didn't erase the damage he had caused. One evening, Elena asked me if we could start over. She said she wanted to rebuild what we had lost, to prove that she could be the partner I deserved. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were pleading. I thought about the life we had shared before Lucas, about the laughter, the late-night talks, and the quiet moments that once felt unshakable. I thought about how much we had both changed and whether there was any way to find our way back. I told her the truth. I said I didn't know if I could ever trust her again, but I wasn't ready to give up entirely. If she was willing to do the work, to face the hard truths and rebuild piece by piece, I'd try to. But I made it clear, this was her last chance. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like walking on glass, and every interaction was weighed down by the past. Some days, I thought we might make it. Other days, the bitterness threatened to swallow me whole. But slowly, painfully, we began to find pieces of ourselves again. Trust wasn't something we could rebuild overnight, and forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Time would tell if we could survive this. But for now, we were trying. And maybe that was enough.